Okay, so I have a few proper videos planned, but I'm just going to give a few unedited thoughts on North Korea and Donald Trump and the whole situation. So the background is that North Korea plans to fire some test missiles towards the Pacific US territory of Guam, and there's an ensuing escalation that's developing between the two countries because of this. Now, I honestly, first of all, North Korea is showing signs of backtracking, so this may not even happen. But some people are suggesting that the most worrying thing about this is that if they accidentally miss and hit the territory, bearing in mind these missiles are not going to be armed in all likelihood, so any suggestion of a nuclear conflict seems quite unlikely. But let's say that these test missiles do hit Guam by accident, then that would at the very least escalate the situation between the two countries and could even be viewed as an act of war. Now, it's important to realise that North Korea doesn't want this to happen, and the reason for that is because the regime values its own self-preservation. Now, why would such a regime want to risk that by threatening the US in the first place, you might ask? And the reason is to maintain this sort of facade. So the context behind this is you have to understand that North Korea is a totalitarian dictatorship with propagandizing on a level that I don't think humanity has really seen before. The propagandizing is really extreme. It's sort of, the social programming is so extreme to the extent that you even have government-approved haircuts. People in North Korea, despite the fact that North Korea is starving its own population, people are propagandizing to believing that North Korea is a beacon of utopian paradise, and the rest of the world is some kind of imperialist aggressor. And the reason that the North Korea is so militaristic is not really in terms of self-defense, because to be clear, in any war between North Korea and the US, the outcome is already decided. North Korea cannot possibly win any kind of conflict, although the cost in terms of lives would be astronomical. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people would die in a conflict involving North Korea and the United States, not least because North Korea has all these artillery pieces pointed directly at Seoul, which is the South Korean capital that lies just on the south side of the border. So in any conflict, you would expect the South Korean capital of Seoul to be leveled to the ground. The consequences of any kind of conflict would be absolutely devastating. But nevertheless, there's still no doubt that North Korea would eventually lose, even though the conflict could well be drawn over several months. They have a chance of winning against the superior forces of the Americans and indeed the South Koreans. But nevertheless, the regime would collapse and North Korea, as we know it, would end. And the regime doesn't want that to happen. They want to keep the regime going. So this external militarism is just a facade. It's a form of social programming of population control. It's a way of portraying North Korea as the North Korean regime as defending the well-being of the North Koreans, when in reality that this isn't, of course, not true. North Korea is starving its own people to death and putting any political distance in horrifying concentration camps. But again, this whole the reason that North Korea is so militarized is just to be consistent with the propaganda. And if you've been propagandized constantly from birth, then you're going to start believing the propaganda. You could call this a form of sociological Stockholm syndrome. So that's kind of the situation that's going on in North Korea. And again, I don't believe for a second that North Korea wants any kind of external conflict, but incompetence on both sides is what could potentially cause it. So now, on the American side, we have Donald Trump, who is looking increasingly like a quite unstable president. So it's almost like the perfect storm. If North Korea screws up and actually hits Guam, and then the US responds in an overly reactionary way, then in theory we could end up with a conflict between North Korea and America. And again, like I've said, I can't exaggerate. I can't sort of understate this, that such a conflict would be devastating. Because, I mean, North Korea has something like the fourth largest army in the world, so it wouldn't be as if the Americans could just win any conflict. It would be a long, drawn-out conflict. And, of course, the loyalty of the North Koreans can't be understated either. I mean, despite the fact that this is a totalitarian regime, and part of the reason that it's lasted for so long is the undying loyalty of the North Koreans through propagandizing, through constant propagandizing. So there's any kind of conflict would have devastating consequences, and the long-term geopolitical consequences are perhaps even more terrifying. Now, the reason for that is because China, there's a reason that China tolerates North Korea. So China is also to some degree a dictatorship. It's not as authoritarian as North Korea. I mean, freedom does exist in China. I mean, the Chinese people do have some semblance of individual freedom, despite the fact that the Chinese government isn't democratic. There is no freedom at all in North Korea. I mean, you have freedom to constantly worship the regime. I mean, I've described North Korea as the only necrocracy on the planet, because Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, is treated like a godlike figure. I mean, there are statues of this guy in the street, and if you don't bow your head when you walk past these statues, you can be taken and put in a concentration camp. The sort of place in North Korea is just awful. So that shouldn't be understated. But China, by comparison, is a beacon of individuality. Now, the reason that China tolerates North Korea is that it doesn't want to end up with a proxy border with the United States, which is what would happen. Because in any conflict between North Korea and the United States, as I've pointed out, the United States would eventually win, and we'd end up with potentially a united Korea, and we'd end up with which would border China, and that would there's potential for even further consequences when we have effectively a border between the United States and China. I mean, of course, in the last Korean War, China did get involved, and you know, if this kind of thing happens again, we could again. I'm not saying that a war between China and the US is by any means guaranteed as a fallout of North Korea, but you can see this as a sort of powder keg situation where the collapse of the North Korean regime could be the first domino in a domino effect that leads to some even greater conflict. Again, I'm not saying that would happen, but it is a possibility that shouldn't be discarded. And China realizes that too, which is why, again, China does tolerate the North Korean regime, despite the fact that North Korea has increasingly alienated itself in recent years. I mean, like, for example, the North Korean refugees, the North Korean defectors, I should say, that managed to escape the regime. Most of them escaped through China, and if any of them are caught, the Chinese government will send them back, despite the fact that they're well aware that North Korean defectors will be put in these camps. And the stories coming out of these camps are absolutely horrifying. I mean, you have stories of people eating rats. Actually being a rat shortage in the camp because it's the only form of protein that these people can get, because they're given like 3 bowls of gruel a day or something, and that's it. And you literally have people being worked to death, and children and the elderly being no exception. I think it's only relatively recently that North Korea abandoned its policy of the grandchildren of political dissidents being in these camps as well. So if your grandfather spoke a word against the regime, then all of his relatives, all of his children, and all of his grandchildren would be condemned to be in these awful labour camps. Still, I mean, it's also worth saying that if the North Korean regime collapsed, we would have a refugee crisis that dwarfs the European situation by contrast. So the sort of, I mean, no one really wants the North Korean regime to collapse in a geopolitical sense, because it would create a lot more problems that no one really knows how to solve. So again, what are you going to do with all these North Korean refugees? It would be up to South Korea to deal with that, and they don't really want to have to deal with the fallout of that. Now, of course, South Korea does accept North Korean refugees as it is, but I mean, again, there's slightly more intolerance to that at the moment than there used to be. So the sort of stipend that the North Korean defectors get is a lot less than it used to be. So even South Korea is becoming a little bit less tolerant to that. So I mean, the fallout of the collapse of the North, I mean, you could argue that maybe things would get better for the North Koreans if the regime collapsed, but I mean, who knows? It's a situation that really nobody wants, and of course the regime doesn't want either. So now my personal prediction is that nothing is going to come out of this. I don't believe anyone really desires a conflict. And if a conflict did happen, it would have to be due to sheer incompetence on both sides, which unfortunately is more likely due to the current president that we have now. Nevertheless, I don't think it's something that is going. I don't think we're on the cusp of World War III, as some people are claiming. I don't think it's that bad. Nevertheless, it's certainly not a good situation. Okay, so those are my unedited thoughts. Thank you for listening.